Hello, class. My name is Carissa Rodriguez, and we're going to digress from Margaret Sanger for a little bit and discuss Elizabeth Cady Stanton, in which how she, was a big part of the women's movement. So then we're going to close with the controversy surrounding Margaret Sanger and an overall conclusion of this presentation. So Elizabeth Cady Stanton was born on November 12th of 1815, and she died on October 26th, 1902. So some side notes that I wanted to give was I wanted to explain how the women's movement is interrelated with these other movements and with these other, opinions and problems in that time. So prohibition was a big part of this time, and it is influenced by the women's movement because many of the people who were opposed to the consumption of alcohol were wives and mothers of people who were affected by alcoholism. And so a lot of women advocated for women's rights so they could vote against the consumption of alcohol. So Elizabeth Cady Stanton was involved in this movement in that she was a part of the Women's State Temperance Society, and she argued that drunkenness was cause for divorce, which is very surprising in a time where divorce was almost unheard of. So that was her role in prohibition and how it related to the women's right movement. Another thing that I wanted to talk about was abolitionism. So she was an abolitionist, and she was the wife of an abolitionist, and that's how she kind of stepped out on the political platform, was advocating for getting rid of slavery. And later on in her speeches, it talks about how there becomes like a racial overtone, and she ended up actually opposing protection of voting rights to African American men. However, this originally was her first political platform. And so my final thing that I kind of wanted to comment on was abortion specifically and how it affected the women's rights movement. So in the beginning, this is part of the early women's rights movement. So she's actually kind of before Margaret Sanger, and she was opposed to abortion, as many women were during that time. So they were advocating for their rights, but abortion was not like a thought, I guess, in their head. So they considered it murdering, and they did not advocate for abortion. They did advocate for birth control. But once the child was conceived, then it was considered, not acceptable. And this is very influenced by Christianity, as most political aspects. So she was very influenced by this religion. But she did feel as if organized Christianity had fundamental, like, sexism at the core of it. And so she, in the middle of her life, ended up breaking away from organized Christianity and finding within her own self her own basis for Christianity. So, her personal life, to give some background, growing up, one of her brothers died, and she told her dad that she was going to do everything that her brother couldn't do because he was no longer with them. And her father is quoted as saying, "Oh, my daughter, I wish you were a boy." So this had obviously a very influential role in her life because a lot of times she did feel like as if she was trying to replace her brother. And so because of this, she was highly educated, and she actually encountered her first conflict with sexism in that she was not allowed into the colleges because they were all male acceptance only. And so she was forced to enter into a female school, a college, a higher education, in which it was deemed that the education was not as on par or as high as the male colleges. So that was her first encounter with sexism, and she was very upset about that because she, was very highly academic achieving, and she achieved better grades and better scores than most of the males in her classes. So she married Henry Brewster Stanton, who was, as I mentioned earlier, an abolitionist, and they had a very unique marriage of that time, since at the altar she removed "promise to obey" from her vows, because she stated um, that I am not going to promise to obey this man if we are entering into a marriage as an equal man and woman. And so this is very unique of this time. Remember, this is the early rights movement, women's rights movement. And so she also participated in what she called as voluntary motherhood, in that the thinking of that time was that the man owned the woman's body, and therefore they could participate in sexual activities whenever he wanted to, when it was his choice to do this. And she said that, no, I'm going to become a mother when I want to become a mother. And so she ended up having 3 boys and 1 girl, but she did so on her timeline and her choice, and it was a mutual agreement between Henry Brewster Stanton and Elizabeth Cady Stanton. And their views, while very differing, he was obviously not for or into the women's rights movement or the suffrage of the voting rights for women, but he was very politically active, and they had a lot of similar dispositions, and so this marriage did work out. Her partner in crime was Susan B. Anthony. And so a lot of times the face of Susan B. Anthony is a lot more prevalent than Elizabeth Cady Stanton. And it was just because Susan B. Anthony wasn't a wife and mother, and she didn't have a family to care for. And so she was very active in that she traveled a lot. She was the face of, the early women's rights movement. And the thing that many people don't realize, though, is that Elizabeth Cady Stanton is actually the woman who wrote most of Susan B. Anthony's speeches. And so it's quoted that she forged the thunderbolts that she fired. So they were very involved together. And it was kind of like Elizabeth Cady Stanton worked from home, and Susan worked, out in the actual field. So they started the National Woman Suffrage Association, and this was in opposition to the American Woman Suffrage Association. And so these are both going on at the same time. And the split there was a 20-year split in the women's rights movement, and it was actually because of this whole opposition to African American rights. And so half of the women were for it and half of the women were against it. And eventually they merged into the National American Woman Suffrage Association in 1890. And this is the main association that we know today, and that was heavily involved in achieving women's rights. And she was very involved in both of them. So many of the things that she voted for, or that she was an advocate for, was not just voting rights, was not just birth control advocate. She was advocate for so many things for women's rights. So parental and custody rights when dealing with divorce, property right issues, which, as Professor Myshik mentioned, is very important in the women's rights movement. And why is it important? She advocated a lot for employment and income rights, so women in the workplaces, and also birth control. So she, like, all of these things are all like bits and pieces that she advocated for, and she did not necessarily go after one specific aspect of women's rights. She was very general in her arguments. And so on the screen, you can see that some of her speeches are right there. One of the most popular ones is the Declaration of Sentiments, which she designed after the Declaration of Independence. And this was during the Seneca Falls Convention in 1948, July 19th and 20th. And she advocated for women's rights and against the oppression of males. And so all of this, she wrote a lot. She wrote a lot of speeches. As you can see, there's a book that she wrote called The Woman's Bible, and a book called 80 Years and More, Reminiscence. And that was her autobiography. So she had a very high expectation for the women's rights movement, and she wanted to revamp not only women, but the understanding of a woman's position in society. And so this again was a very new ideology in this time, and she started a whole snowball effect that Margaret Sanger did pick up and continue with later on. So I'm going to move on to Margaret Sanger and a lot of controversy surrounding her, mostly why did she advocate for birth control? Why did she start Planned Parenthood? And it's not negating the fact that these were very important roles and positions that she took, and she did put forth a lot of things that are now necessary and good today in the women's movement. The main controversy is why. So I'm going to read some quotes here. It says, "We want to exterminate the Negro population." And the other quote is, "We do not want word to go out that we want to exterminate the Negro population. The minister is the man who can straighten out that any idea, if it ever occurs to any of our more rebellious members." And so it's controversial because they say that a lot of Planned Parenthoods were started in areas of lots of high minorities. And so she was very racist in that, she felt like the Negro race or the African American race was inferior. And this is actually a common thinking of that time, right? This is still, we were still working in that time on eliminating slavery. And so this is, again, another occurrence where these different movements are combining and are interrelating, in that, a lot of racism and sexism were still very, very prevalent in that time. So in conclusion, we talked about an earlier context, a historical context. We talked about Emma Goldman and the Comstock laws. We discussed a lot throughout Margaret Sanger and her important role in the women's rights movement. And I hope that you enjoyed this presentation, and I hope that you have interesting questions for us. I hope that we were able to teach you something new that you have never learned before. Thank you.